Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the CEO of the Churchill Club, Karen Tucker.
Thank you so much. Good evening to you. I'm Karen Tucker, CEO of the Churchill Club. Welcome. This is a very special occasion as we welcome Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer and LinkedIn Executive Chairman Reid Hoffman. I'm sure that we will be hearing about Windows 8, Microsoft's future, Steve's personal thoughts on where the industry is headed, and quite frankly, just about anything else that they want to talk about. We have a packed room for this program filled with leaders, pioneers, and innovators from across the nation and around the world, from Silicon Valley to Austin, Boston, New York, Australia, Asia, Europe. And we have come together because we have a common interest in innovation, economic growth, and societal benefit. Especially at a time like this, it's abundantly clear that Silicon Valley is a state of mind that many share, and not just those who call this geographic location their home. We wish to thank our platinum sponsor, Microsoft, for making this program possible. Thank you. And we would also like to thank our gold sponsor, Jabra. And our silver sponsors, Intel, Luxembourg Trade and Investment Office, and Nokia. Thank you all so much. There will be an audience Q&A toward the end of the program. Because time is limited, Reid will read out questions that we collected from audience members prior to tonight. And I would like to thank those of you who responded to the email invitation that we sent out and submitted your questions. We received several dozen of them, and so Reid has quite a lot to work with. If you are tweeting, please use the hashtag Churchill Club, and you'll find other Twitter codes on the back of your printed programs. This event is being live streamed at Fora TV, that's F-O-R-A, or the plural of forum.tv. And the recording will be made available after tonight on demand, also at Fora. Our distinguished interviewer, Reid Hoffman, is executive chairman of LinkedIn Corporation and a partner at Greylock Partners. In 2003, he co-founded LinkedIn in his living room in Mountain View. And today, LinkedIn has a market cap of more than $10 billion. Reid was also a founding board member and executive at PayPal and an early investor in Facebook, Zynga, and more than 80 other startups. He recently co-authored the #1 New York Times bestseller called The Startup of You. And one of the messages in his book is to continually invest in yourself, to keep learning, to keep asking questions of people in your network. And now, in most public events, Reid, of course, is the one who is answering the questions. But tonight, he has agreed to be the question asker himself. Perhaps this is a new role for him on a public stage, but it's something that he loves to do and does do every day as a leader in Silicon Valley, which is to talk to smart people in his network about how to work together to change the world. There's no question that as CEO of Microsoft, our guest of honor, Steve Ballmer, has infused the company with his own brand of energetic leadership, vision, and spirit over the years. Just last week, the Motley Fool referred to Steve as one incredible CEO and truly a class act. They further went on to observe that under Steve's leadership, Microsoft's consistent track record shows 129% revenue growth since 2003. And simply put, you just don't achieve growth like this without solid leadership. And he has certainly had a busy fall as the company has refreshed nearly all of its products and services. From a personal perspective, Steve does his part and has made very large charitable contributions to help children, to fund education, and this spirit of giving has which I think has been inspired both by Steve and Bill Gates, has carried over into Microsoft as a company. They recently celebrated the 30th anniversary of their employee giving program, having donated more than $1 billion to community organizations. Steve is an extraordinary individual, and he has our admiration. Please give your warmest Churchill Club welcome to two foremost leaders of our time, Steve Ballmer and Reid Hoffman.
I guess they thought we'd get thirsty. They gave us more water. So thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Awesome to see you again here in the Valley. Obviously one of the things that's been in the news recently is the transitions in leadership. And obviously the most interesting question for Zinovsky's departure is, what does the future of the organization look like? Kind of where are you going? Has the strategy changed? What is the signal for where you're going?
Well, we're real excited about, both the work we've done and frankly the spectacular start that we got off to with Windows 8. And from a strategy perspective, with all the caveats that says we're always innovating in the next release, but from a strategy perspective, we're kind of all in on what we've done, building on this notion of an integrated experience, a new user interface that's alive and active, a product that's got the best of work and play, tablet and PC coming together, touch and keyboard. We love what we've done, and we think we're off to a very, very good start. We've got a very good team, and Stephen has some other things he wants to do in his life, and he's made one of the most amazing contributions anybody will ever make to any company in terms of guiding a lot of our key activities and doing sort of great work on our engineering systems. And so wish him well, and he's always recommended if you're going to make a change, you make it on a product boundary. And he's living his principles, so to speak, and certainly we wish him well. Our new team is fantastic, maybe a little less well known, but the lady who's taking over the product development function has been with us 20 years, has worked on Internet Explorer and Office and Windows, and has been a driver behind the vision. And we'll continue down the path. It's 400 million roughly computers that get sold with Windows a year, which is pretty exciting. We need to increase that, morph those into tablets, maybe make a little impact on phones, and that would be a great year.
And how do you look at the relationship between the Surface and PCs? Like, is it a small PC? Is it a different kind of device? Is it kind of this combination of work and play?
Yes. No, this notion of the best of worlds is not the craziest notion in the world, as long as you can do it in a way that's no compromise. Can you really give people something that is the best of work and play? Because frankly, anybody who's gone on an overnight trip wants to take something with them, and most people will do some work, and most people will do some play. Do you really want to have a device that is completely without a keyboard? Well, maybe, and we want to give you that option, but many times you don't want a device that doesn't have a keyboard. We want to give you that option. We want to give you the option to lie back, lean forward, or lean all the way forward, and those are all different modes of work, and we think this notion of, we like to call it the best of worlds, was a key part of what we did as we kind of really reimagined Windows. I mean, we support different processors. We kind of have a different programming interface. We built services in for the first time. We've got different physical form factors. And yet, when you show somebody a Surface and they say, oh, I get it. It's a tablet. I have one. Let me just hold it up for purpose. No, this isn't even paid political advertising. It's just, that looks like a tablet, which is great. It's nice to have a tablet, which is great. And it's okay to, throw it in the dock, if you will, and turn it into a notebook. And I don't think that that's actually wrong. I think that's a great concept. And if you want to sit and read like a book, you can. If you want to watch a movie, you can. And if you actually want to do some homework, if you're a student, or you want to do some some work professionally, the office software is all there. Go ahead and have at it.
And is that the key strategy for how it makes a huge footprint in the so-called tablet market? Is because it does the whole breadth?
I think there's a few things we get to work. Number one, we certainly have device types that are different. I showed you this one. I could show you the Asus device. I can show you notebooks running touch. A touch notebook, people initially say, why would anybody want touch on a notebook? And yet that's the thing that's all out of stock, unfortunately, at some of the retailers, because people didn't even believe. But when you sit there and read, a lot of us want to use our thumbs. So what happens is the distinction between a PC and a tablet, I think, at least in our ecosystem, completely goes away. And then you just have to decide what the usage mode is that's best for you. You get a diversity of form factors that runs a broad set of applications. We are, you could say, early in our application ecosystem, but with 400 million new PCs, let's say 250 million of them go out with Windows 8 in the next year, the opportunity for an app developer, I think, is enormous.
Yep. So, but in terms of the, like, so for example, iPad has been, largely, dominant over the next few years. You've got Android tablets coming in. The key thing in terms of saying, now this is why the Surface will make a huge wedge in this. Is it the, obviously developer is important, which is just talked about, and you said, look, we have a broad development platform, so developers are incented. But what are the kind of things where you say, someone's going to go buy this as opposed to the other ones? What are the key things that will have in mind?
Diversity of form factor, I think, actually matters, but without compromising any of the form factors that do matter. A laptop does matter, and a tablet does matter. So you can't compromise in form factor. You need diversity. You need diversity of price point. I actually think that's quite important, and you will see a range of price points across tablets, PCs. You have to have enough volume to attract developers. And there are actually different kinds of developers. The apps that are done for phones that get ported to PC, to tablet is one thing. The apps that get written really for the big screen, historically, much, much higher revenue set of opportunities, but you want to be able to sort of pour the innovation that comes from the phone up and from the PC down into kind of a common set of devices. So I think we can leverage kind of the biggest app ecosystem that makes sense once you get over about 4 inches. We got some work to do below 4 inches or below 5 inches, which is still very interesting. So big app ecosystem, diversity of price, a UI that's frankly very different. It's the most different. It's not a sea of icons. It's actually a UI that is alive with the things that are important in people's lives, the people they care about, the information they care about. It's a point of view. There's certainly a big point of view difference, and just as a lucky strike extra, you can write everything in JavaScript and HTML, and at least as I cruise up and down the valley, the hardest thing right now, everybody's got JavaScript and HTML skills. It's hard to find people with all other skill sets are in shorter supply, which means kind of an easier on-ramp for developers.
Now, one of the things that's kind of interesting when you chart the recent, last decade history of what you guys have been doing is this kind of move from just pure software to hardware, right? You've got Xbox as a primary entrant, doing the home systems. You've now got the Surface. There's broad rumors, which obviously can't really comment on, as are you going to do a phone? Silicon Valley people, we gossip a lot amongst each other, right? But what does that mean in terms of the elaboration and the change of your strategy? Is it now kind of like, okay, we have to do devices as well? We're no longer, kind of purely working through ISVs. How does that strategy change?
Well, there is, I'll say, a shift. I don't know about a change, complete change. No. If you take a look at it, do I anticipate that partners of ours will build the lion's share of all Windows devices over the next 5 years? The answer is absolutely I do. Windows phones, Windows PCs, Windows tablets, Windows all-in-ones, Windows huge screens, Windows in the whatever. The partners will build the lion's share of those. With that said, it is absolutely clear that there's an innovation opportunity on the seam between hardware and software, and that is a seam that must not go unexploited at all by Microsoft. And you can get in a chicken and an egg situation when you're trying to do innovation based entirely on work with partners. So we continue to work with the silicon vendors, with HP and Dell and Toshiba and Sony and Lenovo and Asus and Acer and Samsung, great, and others, great partners, HTC and Nokia, great partners. But what we want to do is just say, if we think there is innovation that's going to cross that hardware-software boundary, we're not going to cede that to competition as a first mover thing. I think in Xbox, we got a lot of that right. In Surface, we're getting a lot of that right. And that's why I kind of say to our folks now, and we wrote in our annual shareholder letter, we thought of ourselves as a software company. Software's still the skill to have, in my opinion. And yet, when we think about how we go to market, it'll be through devices and online services as opposed to software in its, quote, traditional form.
But doesn't that also, I mean, the natural thing is that gives you a little bit of tension, because if you're also a primary seller of devices, services, and so forth, and you're doing the ISVs, how do you plan on navigating that tension with your ecosystem?
Carefully, of course, would be a good answer. The truth of the matter is, if you sort of play it up front, you tell people what you're going to do, and there's no piece of software that we're not licensing to our partners. I mean, that's part of the reason to go do this, is to also enable partner innovation. That is very, very important. We cut this a little bit differently in all three device classes. In the case of Xbox, we just built it on device and kind of had to, because the model in video games was lose money on the hardware, make it up on the back end. It's hard to share those economics. In the phone, what we decided to do was more tightly define the hardware spec, and we did that, and then work with that in conjunction with Samsung and HTC and Nokia and now others. And in the case of the PC, we have a very open set of innovation that's going on around Intel Core and Intel Atom processors, and we're trying to be a little bit more tightly prescribed in terms of both our partners and our own work on ARM processors.
But do you think, in this kind of thing you can't comment concretely, but will Microsoft ship a PC?
Well, will we ship a PC? I don't know what to call this. For some people, it is a PC. For my son, who uses it all day, every day for his homework, I think you'd say it's a PC for all intent and purposes. But it depends on what you define these devices. We have announced, we've shipped the Surface RT. We've announced a product called Surface Pro that's got an Intel Core processor in it with Windows Pro. We said that would ship about 90 days after, and there's no new news on that. So we are shipping these things, but we're not shipping a clamshell. We're not shipping. We think our OEMs do a very, very good job. They push very hard. I mean, I'll just hold it up. I'm going to actually demo it. But no, look, this is 2.2 pounds. It's 2.2 pounds. It runs Windows 8. It's got a Core i5 processor in it, and it turns on pretty quick. But it's a touchscreen, and it's a great piece of work. There's no reason for us to do this is from Acer, but it's a great piece of work, and our OEMs are doing great work, and we're excited about that. Same thing in the phone category. I mean, if you take a look at the hardware with Windows Phone, the best cameras, the best screens, the best audio are available from our partners. And why just sort of repeat something that other companies are doing brilliantly, so to speak?
So the strategy a la Surface and these things is where the innovation requires a conjunction, you may become a direct
participant.
Yes.
That's right. Or we're the business model, which is how we got to Xbox, really.
Yep.
We got that, and I'm glad we did, because Connect was an innovation that was born sort of diving into the living room with a hardware and software play.
Yep.
There's no way something like Connect ever gets invented unless you're doing hardware and software, because you're load balancing how much compute you're doing actually in the sensor and how much you're doing in the processor. And I'm delighted, that's an innovation that now we're transferring over to the PC ecosystem.
Yep. And so is Connect, do you think, going to become part of the standard Windows platform?
I think it'll
Windows
become
9?
Standard in certain environments. It'll be supported in a very consistent way. Do I think we're all going to be waving and jumping up and down in front of the small screens? We may want to from time to time. We have a pretty good-sized processor in the Connect today, so probably requires a little innovation before it makes sense in all these devices.
So let's touch briefly on the Home OS and Xbox. What do you see as the future in terms of how the kind of OS running the home? Obviously, Xbox, part of the living room, the large screen. You've talked about there's a whole sequence of screens for development. But what particularly do you think is kind of what the future of how kind of software powering the home, and is the Xbox the primary way that Microsoft delivers, or is there a conjunction vision coming?
Well, there's kind of, let me call it, there's kind of a horizontal and a vertical. The truth of the matter is, if you just count up computers in a home today, phones is the number one computer. I call them all computers. If you got a processor and memory and you run software, you're kind of a computer to me. So number one computer you'll find in all homes is a phone. Then you get to kind of PCs, tablets, and then in a lot of homes you'll have some intelligence that's really general purpose that's affiliated with the big screen. And so laterally, what's going to control all that? I mean, the truth of the matter is a lot of that will be peer-to-peer. A lot of that will ping through the cloud. It's ironic, but if you want to log into the computer next to you, the easiest thing to do may be to have them both rendezvous through, for example, your Microsoft account, in our case in the cloud. The other question, though, is what is the innovation that's really going to change the big screen, the TV? Yep. And we're pretty excited. I'll just give you an example from Xbox. For the presidential debates, which is commodity content, so it's got the right licensing price, if you will, we ran kind of interactive polling with Kinect, with the sensors for our Xbox Live audience. We had hundreds of thousands of people participating, and not on a second screen where you have to have your head down banging away. There will be times you want to use the second screen, but a lot of times people want to share that big screen, and I think the kinds of innovations that we did there were good. I found it a little ironic that Time Magazine wound up quoting Xbox polls after one of the debates. As you could say that was heartening. Let me use that word.
Yep. Well, one of the things, actually, it's funny, I wasn't originally planning on asking you this question, but I think it's an interesting one. So you said the right licensing price was free. Obviously, one of the questions is, how is content streaming? There's speculation, which you can't comment on, which is the whole Netflix thing. But what is your view of the model of content business models, licensing fees, advertising? How does that play to the Xbox? How does that play to the OS?
I think you got to start with the fact that not all creators are the same. I mean, one of the things people get confused about is all creators want the same thing, and they don't. The guy who produces a 5-minute video that goes on YouTube, he's going to settle for a very different business model than James Cameron, who I gather was here at the Churchill Club and produces whatever it is, $120 million fixed cost movie. And getting those things confused can lead to very dangerous conclusions. And there are people who are going to want very expensively produced content, and there are people who are going to want very cheaply produced content. I think getting caught in the middle could be a tough game. That is, having something that's sort of expensive, too expensive to monetize, but not expensive enough to really pop. I wonder where that will, and you can go through whether it's kind of what's going to happen with news, or what's going to happen with movies, or what's going to happen with TV and other video forms. You can kind of go through this. We just released Halo 4. Halo 4 did $220 million in its first, day, 2 days. And believe me, it had a big production budget. And the only way to monetize it is by charging people money for it. And maybe not everybody will buy it, but the people who buy it, they'll buy it. And James Cameron's gambling the same thing pretty much on every movie they do. The blogger who works half-time and is making kind of $100,000 a year based upon AdSense ads, that's a different content model. And that's going to be more likely ad-funded, et cetera. So I think having a mix of these things is very important. The question is, what happens to the NFL? You're going to pay for the NFL. I don't ever think anybody's going to Netflix at an everyday low price, single fee. I think the NFL's got enough oomph that that'll never happen, or at least not my lifetime. And it ain't happening to the NFL. Yep. And if you're really, kind of small, low budget, you don't even want the Netflix, you don't want to go into the bundle. You just want to do your own ad-funded type thing, maybe even micropayments for some of this stuff. So I do think there's going to be a role for kind of interesting subscriptions in between. There's going to be a role for sort of per watch or per, where you know what you're buying content on the front end. And then there's going to be a tail that's going to be largely ad-funded.
Yeah.
And I think that's true. You could say that's true in games. You could say that's true in movies. You could say that's true in next generation interactive formats. I think it applies across the board.
Let's go back, because it's the final touch on home. I'm kind of moving from home gradually to the enterprise, through consumer devices. On mobile, obviously this is a difficult competitive area, right? There's everyone's kind of pretty clear on what the Apple strategy is. It's kind of iOS is the device to beat. Android and Google kind of says, well, we don't have quite as good a product, but it's got a better free distribution model and maybe better cloud services. What's the Windows strategy in this?
Well, I think both guys have obviously done a great job, and we need to stake out a position through 2 or 3 different things. Number one, the ecosystem of Android is a little bit wild, relative. That is, from an app compatibility perspective, a malware perspective, it is maybe in a way that's not always in the consumer's best interest. It is uncontrolled. Conversely, the Apple ecosystem looks highly controlled and, by the way, quite high priced. The fact that we live in a country where almost every phone is subsidized, you may forget it, but I was in Russia last week where you pay $1,000 for an iPhone. You're not going to sell that many iPhones relatively in Russia. So the question is, how do you get the quality, but maybe not at the premium price, with a controlled, but maybe not quite as controlled ecosystem? And yet, how do you allow for some of the lower price points, more affordability, diversity that comes with Android? And I think you could say that's kind of the best of both worlds, and I think that's available to us. That would be number one. Number two, the truth of the matter is the operators around the world who actually pay for most of the phones. The operators, you could say who's the customer. If manufacturer X or A or whatever charges an operator $600 and you pay $200, that means somebody paid $400 for your phone. And you might say, hey, I give it back in monthlies, but somebody's making a conscious upfront decision. The operators who buy a lot of these phones really want 3 vendors. And today they really have Apple and Samsung in high volume. You could say Apple and Android if you like, but the truth of the matter is on the high end you have Apple and Samsung. On the low end you do have a sea of lower priced competitors. But that high end is where a lot of the profitability is in the plans. So we have a customer set that wants an alternative. We've got a differentiated point of view, or differentiated opportunity strategically. And then if you go look at the product's got to be great. And if you look at what we've done with Windows Phone 8 in terms of being really, I would say, the most personal smartphone. When you really whip out your phone, you really just want to see the things that matter to you, as opposed to whipping through. We think we've done good innovation in that area. A lot of people are going to own Windows devices. Just making it real easy to move things back and forth between Windows phones and other Windows devices, we think will be appealing to a lot of people. And as good a job as both Apple and Google have done on aspects of this, the notion of really using the cloud for seamless roaming of everything, notes, personalization, photos, I think there's just a lot of opportunity still for innovation. And the hardware's not going to stay the same. Was it just this morning, I think I read the article about Samsung pioneering new plastic screens that'll change the way phones are designed. If anybody thinks we're at the end of the hardware innovation chain in pocket-sized devices, I think that's nuts.
Yep. And do you think that there's anything, like in terms of cloud integration of the phone? Obviously, one of the things that Apple had a debacle in the last month was maps, right? These sorts of things. Is there anything particularly in the kind of the services vision that you were talking earlier that you think, when you think of the phone and what the direction of Microsoft, OS and product is, that the services vision needs to be highlighted?
Well, I know we designed this stuff, and I know, I'm not supposed to be surprised that stuff actually just works the way it was designed to work. But the first day you're sitting in a meeting on your tablet, Windows tablet with a pen, and you make a note, and you go out to the car, and right there on your phone is the inked note that you just made, and you can forward it immediately with your inking onto your assistant or chief of staff, or I met Reid's chief of staff backstage who's had an exciting time on Reid's book tour. But the fact that stuff is just boom, it just really all works. It's really quite remarkable. And that's it's a small case, and yet we have to remember how much more is going to happen. Maps debacles aside, just take the amount of innovation that will happen around location and geographic data and intent and what we show you on your phone. I mean, this notion that says I really just go to my phone and it's really easy when I'm in a store to price shop something. I mean, that's something Amazon will do for you. But the technology doesn't facilitate that. It doesn't facilitate it for the first-party retailer who wants to solve these problems, nor does it solve it for the shopping site. I just think there's so much opportunity with sort of cloud-backed services to innovate in the device itself.
So let's take a different tangent on the cloud. Cloud's obviously transforming enterprise a lot. There's been, a bunch of interesting recent IPOs. There's been a lot of work, everything from Salesforce initially, and then a whole stack of cloud transformation. What's your view in terms of the cloud transformation of enterprise? How does that play out into the Microsoft strategy? And is there anything you see as the next phase after cloud?
Yeah, let's just take cloud and then we're good. That day, wow!
Yes.
Reid and I had a great dinner one night where there was a lot of wow, but let me start in the next few years
Yes.
first. You take a look at it, you say, where are we in the cloud, sort of the evolution of the cloud, particularly from a business perspective, and I would say we're sort of in the early part of the game. Most enterprise infrastructure is still on-premise. We can say some of it has moved, or even a significant part maybe have moved to the private cloud. That's not the same as the public cloud. So the infrastructure hasn't moved. There are a lot of applications out there that have been written, and they're only partially adopted relative to on-prem applications, whether it's even in the popular ones, CRM, our Office 365 product. These things are all relatively early in adoption. So you have the application level, the infrastructure level. And the new innovation in business applications is really early stage. I'm going to compliment and pick on Reid. When I first heard of LinkedIn, I wouldn't have thought it was an enterprise app. It wasn't my first concept. It may have been your conceptualization when you started, but it was a B2C app. And of course, today it's a B2B2C application. It's mission critical for recruiting departments. It has morphed. That's innovation. And the notion of using the cloud for different kinds of connections with people that might feel B2C and might feel B2B, that's sort of a surface that's just being scratched. We bought Yammer. Yammer's part of a view that we have that says you need to mix the B2B and B2C worlds. I think LinkedIn has done that brilliantly. And you can go category by category of what things do in business and say, have they been transformed with app innovation that really uses the cloud? Not just the cloud as an infrastructure to deliver the same old stuff, but to really write new stuff the way you guys did at LinkedIn. Yep. I think we're so early in that game that there's going to be a lot of companies that get started. And you won't know whether to call them enterprise or consumer companies, but they will be monetized. Even things that are ad funded. It's worth asking, are those consumer or enterprise plays, because you're still selling to marketing departments at the end of the day.
Yep. No, absolutely. And I think you're right about the blend between, there's all kinds of different places where consumer starts touching enterprise and it gets gray. One of the interesting things is, what does that mean for the kind of the enterprise OS level, right? Because you begin to say, well, we do hosted software, we begin to do things in the cloud. Part of, classically has been a set of, really deep platform technologies, Exchange, the way the Office works together, productivity, SharePoint stuff. That begins to get changed. The playing field changes as you move to the cloud. So you're going to have to, evolve your strategy, and you're doing that already. What's the tip you would give to enterprises, the tips you would give to developers thinking about building on it in this future?
Look, everybody's always got to be on their toes at all times. Yep. So we have some success, but you either move forward or you go away. My favorite thing about our business comes out of Annie Hall. It's an old Woody Allen movie. He says relationships between men and women are like sharks. They move forward or they die. So are technology companies. You either move forward or you die. Yep. And it's an area in which certainly we're moving forward pretty aggressively. The thing that's important to recognize is enterprises are not exactly the same. Even with the so-called consumerization of IT, they're not the same. Enterprise IT managers really do have a different set of requirements that are put on them for availability and security of corporate information. There really are a lot of systems in these institutions which are not the consumers. They're running the shop floor, they're doing, so there's a management responsibility, there's the security of corporate data. What stops me in the consumerization of IT of taking the plans for our new blah, blah, blah product out? That data does need to be secured. Whether the device is secured or it's a consumer device, the information needs to be secured. Corporate data needs to be archived. There's compliance requirements. First time I met Reid was shortly before your IPO. You understand post-IPO how much there is in compliance and blah, blah, discovery and blah, blah, blah.
I feel your pain.
So there are some differences and there's some similarities. And one of the things we think of as sort of key for us is helping IT chart a new course. The consumerization of IT isn't just about the consumer. It's actually about IT and helping IT say, okay, we're not all about setting up systems and managing them and deploying software to them. We are actually about applications, business process, availability, and security. It kind of morphs role, and the technology is going to have to help IT get there, whether it comes from our company or also, kind of active startups.
But one of the things I think, just to linger on this point for one more kind of question, which is some of the notion of what is platform changes, right? Because platform used to be, has to run on this kind of client-server architecture. This is what developers build to. Now it's off-premise. It may be in a kind of a centralized cloud. People talk about Facebook and LinkedIn as platforms. These are all evolution of the notion of thinking about platforms. Windows, and Microsoft's fundamentally a platforms company. How is the platform of the enterprise changing with a move to the cloud? And how should developers who are thinking about building apps on the Windows ecosystem, how should that change? I completely agree with you, by the way, that people are frequently lax in their thinking and say, oh, just the consumer moves because there's all these other requirements to go in the enterprise. But how should developers think about it, and how should the platform now be thought of?
Let me tell you a deep, dark secret that has always been true, but people act like it's not. The best platform has always been an extensible application. Okay? You could say, what did we really sell? We happened to monetize Windows and Office separately, but the device that really got sold and gets sold in hundreds of millions was a device that had Windows and Office. And Windows happened to provide the natural extension layer, and Office was an extensible application, but they were kind of, you could think of them as one thing. If you look at kind of SAP or any of the big applications, the thing that has made them important and sticky and long-lived is all the customizations and, if you will, the use of SAP as a platform on which to invoke business logic. And you see that in Oracle strategy over time. I mean, the notion that says there's not really a platform in an app, but these things are kind of, let's just say, they run in, it's a rainbow. The color sort of fans out. Take directory. Is directory an app or a platform? Well, I know that our directory got established because of Outlook and Exchange, and that it gets used as a platform for other applications, but never would have gotten established as a platform without an app. So then you say, okay, now in the cloud, what does all that mean? It means what are the key apps? What are the key extensibility? How do you get critical mass behind an app, whether you're Microsoft or LinkedIn or Salesforce.com? Everybody, I think, kind of gets this fact that anything that becomes popular should be extensible. And the best way to get popular is actually to be useful, and useful is best applied usually to applications because they get used sort of out of the gate, if you will.
And so do you see Office 365 as a platform?
I do.
And what kinds of developers do you see building on top of it?
Well, certainly at the SharePoint layer, let me just give you some examples. At the SharePoint layer, we see a lot of people doing essentially what I might call lightweight, enterprise-oriented, rapid application development. At the directory layer, we see a lot of people who just want to sort of plug in to the SharePoint Exchange, the Exchange SharePoint Office infrastructure and get extensibility through what we now call Azure Active Directory. On the client side, we've introduced an extensibility model where you can either run the extensions, you run them in Office, but they can be run client side or server side. It's a new Office extensibility model that comes with the release that comes out right now. with Link slash Skype, which will come together and help support communications and virtual meetings. The real question is, how do you keep adding value to a real-time communication session where the amount of ideas people have is a lot, as long as we have kind of a UI model that permits that and a way for people to sort of invoke Link or Skype or the combination, which is really where we're going as a platform. So, I'll give you just sort of 4 or 5 quickies, but there is an extensibility model that, through the directory, through the back end, through the connection between the front end and the back end, through the real-time communication layer. SharePoint already has been a place where people have built document managers and repositories and record managements and corporate portals. Yammer has an incredible extensibility model, which we started talking about at our SharePoint conference last week and how those things come together. So there's all kinds of opportunities for extension of that application.
And what kinds of, in terms of the interface of these kinds of platforms in Silicon Valley, most of the things that I see as kind of VC are kind of pure cloud apps. So they're multi-tier provision through the cloud. They're not actually building necessarily an Office 365 or other sorts of things. What do you see as the interface with Silicon Valley and these platforms?
Yeah, people don't build on it. They build. It's kind of like a LinkedIn ad. You connect.
Yeah.
Everything's about connection. Nothing's about, hey, I got to run in the same data center than you do. Let me just give you the simplest case. We got huge interest on everybody who sells to enterprises to integrate with the directory. Well, how do you get single? Just take something like single sign-on. It doesn't mean somebody's got to put code in our data center. But as you would know from LinkedIn or Facebook, you need to have a way to call APIs and get sort of the right connection done. You don't need to run on our SharePoint infrastructure in our data center, but you need to have an extension that will show up from a UI perspective in the context of the SharePoint portal site that somebody might have deployed for their, just take 401k processing. If you have a 401k processing app, you want to reflect it through the corporate portal. You're not going to actually run on our SharePoint implementation in our data center, but you are going to plug in from a UI perspective across the cloud, if you will.
So it's part of it is, platform is connectivity. But if you were talking to a bunch of Silicon Valley startups, because part of obviously one of the things we think about is how are we building the next versions of the future? And we're thinking about how we interface with the Microsoft platforms in terms of so doing. Which ones would you highlight as for both consumer and for enterprise startups saying, here's key things in terms of how our platform operates, how we're building that platform to amplify your business? What are the ones that you would say you should pay attention here, here, and here?
4 things, and I'll riff through them quickly. You really want to be on Windows and Windows Phone with client applications. We will have high volume, certainly with Windows, and I think it'll become sort of obvious on the phone side too. Number 2, in terms of the consumer side infrastructure, really integrating with our account infrastructure and our storage infrastructure facilitates a lot of things, particularly your startup. Once somebody's logged into their Windows PC, you probably want to accept that login. You probably want to be able to store things where they can find them. You probably want your personalizations and your application to roam through our infrastructure. There's no reason for a startup to do that on the consumer-facing side. Number 3, whether you're enterprise-facing or consumer-facing, people like to start with what I'd call low CapEx and then decide whether they want to go high CapEx. I encourage people to take a look at our Azure infrastructure, both because people should look at it when they're also looking at AWS to get started, and because, frankly, we will have services that make it easier to write Windows and Office extensions on Azure. And if that happens, it's a recursion right there, but
Yes.
If you happen to be interested in anything else, we happen to facilitate it. And then last, I'd really say the integration with Office is really about the directory and about SharePoint. And the directory is about Outlook, and that's the one I would say is probably easiest for anybody who is enterprise focused. Whether you're trying to work inside corporate confines, we'll align Yammer so that you get kind of a viral approach. You get to extend identity, your corporate identity, inside and outside the organization, and we can do that through the Azure directory and Yammer.
And are there any particular startups that are doing that, like best of breed today in the Valley, that are high on your list?
Yeah, if you take a look, take a look at everybody SAP and Oracle's bought recently. To the first degree, we've had a lot of good discussions with all of them actually about Azure Active Directory, and a number of them have moved forward. And everybody else who has those kind of enterprise SaaS applications, that's been a big opportunity for us. We've also seen people on the client side do some interesting work. Mobilogy is a company that tries to help save people money in the way they use data and applications on phones. That's a Windows Phone application. There's one I'll go that's a little further afield called Gentronics. It's a biomedical company that actually uses Xbox and Kinect to help with certain kinds of therapy, particularly with people who have neurological issues, which has been, I think it's a super interesting app, and it's kind of one people resonate with.
So let's shift to kind of the play within the internet, right? So, obviously, there's relatively little new to say, but there's a battle on search. There's questions about what's happening with kind of social networking. There's questions of, what the next what Microsoft's entry on this, because there's been MSN, there's Bing, there's like, what's your kind of corporate view of how Microsoft plays on the internet, and how does it play with all these platform apps, and where do you see the future of this?
A mental model is there's sort of three entries to the tech world. You can come in through devices, you can come in through enterprise services, or you can come in through consumer services. And I'll just say for proxy, Google's through consumer services. We really came through devices, but now people think of us as being very enterprise services focused, but our basic main play is still devices. 400 million, that's a pretty good sized number. And I would say Oracle, SAP, Salesforce have come through enterprise services, and Apple obviously comes through devices. The truth is, it's not clear to me that anybody's going to be incredibly successful and try to attack the problem in all three ways. But you will have to play in all three areas in order to be sort of as successful, at least as we would choose to be. Our device play is, I think, pretty clear. Our enterprise services play is pretty clear. If you look at what is our highest volume consumer service, of course, it's Skype. And one of the key issues, key opportunities for us in that acquisition was to have some strength. Now, we're doing a good job of integrating it with our devices, but we keep it cross-platform. That's very important to us. It is a foundational element. Bing, also very important, growing very well. A lot of work to do with Bing. But a lot of Bing will be about making our devices and everything else better. And some of Bing will be just out there sort of independently trying to blow in the wind against Google, which we will do. We've made some progress in the United States. We're, someplace close to 30% market share between us and Yahoo. A lot of work to do. And outside the U.S., a lot more work to do. But, we have done a good job of integrating, from a design perspective, Bing into the overall Windows 8 experience.
So a reference to your earlier Shark comment, what do you think the key risks are in Microsoft's future? And kind of how are you addressing them?
Well, let me be simple. Number one, risk is the things where you're not successful, you never get there. Risk number two is the things where you are successful, you screw it up, or you fail to move forward. And risk number three is you don't have the talent and the IQ and the discipline and the culture that lets you do one and two above. And that's true at Microsoft, that'd be true at the guys we compete with, the guys we partner with. I mean, it's true for everybody. And you say, what keeps you up most at night? The answer would be that. You've got to have great talent, but you also have to have a real point of view about how you're going to innovate and do things differently in the areas where you're not strong. And the kinds of innovations that make sense will be different in businesses where you don't yet play versus businesses where you do play. In businesses where you invent categories versus businesses where you don't invent categories. And, in a sense, I know people think tech is a sort of a great place to invest because there's a lot of growth potential. But I think tech's also a place where you kind of have to reinvent yourself more frequently than you would. I worked at Procter & Gamble. It's the only other place I work, and they have reinvented themselves nicely as a company, and yet the pace of change in brownie mix, which was the product I worked on. Procter & Gamble's out of that business.
I never knew
It's
that.
just not quite the same. And the need to rethink is not quite as high in the brownie mix business, I've found. Or the blueberry muffin mix business. And so this notion of talent, culture, certainly very important. And then the continuous, are we headed the right path? How do we go there faster? And where's the new thing?
Yeah.
Where's the new place we have to go?
But one of the central challenges when you become a massive tech company, a platform definer, is the so-called Innovators Dilemma. Self-cannibalization. It's somewhat what underlies the move to the cloud and enterprise. It's a constant challenge once you actually have the dominant. How do you approach that personally? How do you approach that with the company? Like when you get internal Innovators Dilemma, because the natural organization is to avoid it until it's too late.
I think at least the leadership has to be almost overly insistent on sort of pursuit of the new strategy. I'm not saying randomize, change direction every 5 minutes. I don't think changing directions every 5 minutes is very helpful for a company. On the other hand, if you're successfully going this direction, being the leaders who insist that you go that way, and maybe you'll even leave a little money on the table this way. I think it was probably 5 years ago, probably 8 or 9 years ago when we started what became Office 365. We actually started with a couple customers, Energizer, the battery guys, but we just had to insist. And people said, is this really our future? Yes, just let's do it. Let's get moving. Let's move. And they say, but we could be adding these 4 features to something. No, let's move. And it doesn't mean you'll always do it right, but at least in the tech industry, you have to have that insistence. Because whether the generation of stuff you're working on is 5, I actually think most things have a generation more than a year or 2. Mm-hmm. But I think most things in our business don't have much more than 5 to 10. And as soon as things move to the internet, the speed of generational change, because essentially distribution barriers to entry have gone down versus when I started at Microsoft, for example. I think it's even more important that you just say, hey, look, we're going to be reinventing ourselves every someplace between 5 and 10 years, and it's got to come from the leadership.
In the last 10 years or so, what's the hardest Innovators Dilemma jumping the gap that you've faced? That you said, okay, I know that this is where my revenue stream is, but I have to self-cannibalize here because that's where the future is.
Well, probably with that definition, and I'll give you an alternate. With that definition, I'd say the cloud for our peoples was the hardest 4, 5, 6 years ago, because people said, we're not sure how we're going to make money on foo, and we're making a lot of money on bar. And I'm talking about the enterprise cloud. And we just said, hey, look, don't worry about it. Mm-hmm. Go do it. Don't worry about it. We'll kind of figure it out, which is not sort of intrinsic in the way bigger companies do things. Startups do it that way because they know they'll just go out of business and go do another. No, I mean, statistically, that's truthful. So, I think, and I think that was very, very important for us. The other thing you do is how do you tie up resource? It's a little bit different, which is how much resource do you put in improving the things that you need to improve, that customers really want you to improve, versus how much do you allocate resource, particularly IQ, not just headcount, but IQ to working on new things. And we had a kind of a trap a little bit with our kind of Longhorn Vista thing 10 plus years ago, where we had resources that we couldn't be as agile with because we had people tied up longer than we want to, essentially, working on something that was important but wasn't as forward-looking as, say, getting on our phone strategy.
Yep. Actually, I just realized as part of this discussion, and an earlier thing you said was, how do you define your customer, right? Because there's one customer, which is a kind of a sense of like businesses, enterprises. One way you can look at it is actually like Oracle is all enterprise, nothing else. Google is essentially consumer, although they have some enterprise apps and some other things that are playing. How does Microsoft define its customer? What is your scope? Is it just everybody with something, or is it?
No, I think look, in the tech business, when it comes down to it, there seem to be four ways to pay for things. I'll just mention those. Consumers do 2 things. They buy devices and they buy telecom services. So you either better sell them a device or you better get the phone company to pay you for something, because most of us aren't going to be phone companies. And then enterprises spend money in two ways, through IT departments and through marketing departments. And I don't know whether Google's an enterprise company or a consumer company, but most of their money comes from those marketing departments. And then developers make everything go round. So, you could say developers, IT people, marketing people, consumers, and telcos seem to be the 5 places to try to monetize almost any tech investment. And so then the question is, where do you play? Today we play with the consumer through Windows devices. We certainly play through the IT department. We have a $3 billion or so advertising business, which means we're playing through marketing departments in a pretty significant way. We're still pretty small, actually, through telecom companies, although that's certainly a big deal. Sharing in telecom revenue is essentially what Android and iOS are doing through the subsidy that comes from the operator. And as I said, developers, the juice, the innovation, the extensibility that sort of cement everything.
So do you basically, in terms of strategy, do you say these are the 5 customer groups we need to adopt, and then each product is essentially targeted at that? Because they actually
we start
combine
actually with the
ways.
product and get to the customer, because everything can have, the business model when you start something is not generally as obvious as the customer value proposition. That's part of the problem of today's internet. As I said, when I first heard of LinkedIn, I would not have guessed it was really going to be the HR departments at companies that wound up being kind of the number one, at least first generation revenue driver for you guys. And so I think
that was in our Series A deck.
I actually believe that too. I didn't see your Series A deck, and I said, okay, pretty clever. And you just have to say to yourself, what's the value proposition that we're trying to build? Find a monetization model, as opposed to say, we're trying to give telcos everything they want. We're trying to give consumers, because then you miss these connections like we have. Essentially the consumerization of IT or using Office at home and work, that's a connection point. You're not really building for one customer or the other. You're trying to span. Building something that's for the consumer and for the employer. You're trying to span. So I think rather than go from customer to product, it's always better to go from product to customer.
Yeah, and then some products are usually some combination of customers they're buying.
Yeah, the strongest ones. I think the strongest ones in our industry actually are.
So it's time for us to move to audience Q&A, which I think I'm the vehicle for. So hopefully I'll get it right for the folks whose questions I'm asking. I thought this one was particularly good. What's been the biggest surprise to you about early reaction to business customers to Windows 8?
Touch. In a sense, you could say, okay, business customers, they're going to be the slowest to be interested. But of course, IT people are some of the most intense users of computing around. And, the sort of intense interest in the IT community in all things touch, even in laptops and, sort of, let me call them desktop kiosk form factors, has been great. And I think actually there's a little feature of Windows 8, which, God, the IT people really love. It's called Windows to Go. You can put Windows on a USB stick, and you can bring your whole Windows environment, just plug it in and run it. And the level of kind of froth about that has been very gratifying.
So I'm going to morph the second question a little bit.
Yep.
Since I know you, I'm going to answer the question and then ask the follow-up to it, which is, are you confident that Microsoft Windows Phones 8 can take a material share of the smartphone market? The simple answer is yes, from anyone who knows you. But the real question is the basis of that confidence. Say what you think are the key moving drivers that make that a high likely outcome.
I'm going to go back to the dialogue we had earlier, and I probably won't repeat it all, but strategically, we think there's a place to be kind of the best of organization and the best of diversity, which we don't think competition does. That's important. From a customer perspective, we think there's an unmet need effectively with the operators, which I highlight. And from a consumer perspective, all these darn phones look basically the same, and there's a lot of opportunity to innovate with a different point of view. You could say, our challenge right now is not getting 60% of the smartphone market. Our challenge is to get 10, and then get 15, and then get 20. And our challenge is not to go from where we are, which is a single-digit percentage, to 60 overnight. And I think a differentiated point of view that really focuses in on being very personal and working really well for people who carry Windows devices. I think that's the product innovation, the strategic innovation, and kind of the customer, let me call it the customer innovation.
And you know, this is always tricky in public companies, but do you share with people what your targets are in terms of percentage?
This public company does not.
Okay. Yep. So,
No, some public companies choose to do it.
Yep.
My advice for entrepreneurs is, when you become a public company, avoid it if you can, because, well, it can force strategic action. I mean, you don't want to give up strategic freedom because you basically promised a set of targets that don't make sense anymore for whatever set of reasons. And, you know, if you have to, you have to, but it does take away strategic flexibility.
So this question is actually another angle of something we've already talked about, but I think it's a good additional angle, which is, what do you most pay attention to in Silicon Valley? E.g., what are the trends that you see here? You know, I had asked you this in a version of how should Silicon Valley companies look at the Microsoft OS, but what do you see happening here? How do you connect with the Valley? What are the things that you view as useful from what you learn and take away from here?
Yeah, I would say we say Silicon Valley, and there's about 4 Silicon Valleys. There's the Silicon Valley that doesn't get written about as much as it used to, that actually builds kind of silicon layer infrastructures for things, new chips, networking, storage. That still exists. You wouldn't believe it necessarily reading the popular press, but it's really very important. Most of it still in Silicon Valley. That's one.
Actually, it's around us here.
It's around us. I mean, and Intel's one, but the number of guys who are doing new high-speed networking interconnects and what that means for the way you design clouds, and I mean, there's a huge amount of innovation actually going on at that lowest level, and it is mostly based in Silicon Valley. Number 2 is what I would call the sort of consumer and application innovation, which is mostly actually feels like it's moving to San Francisco to me. The number of trips I've made down here recently, quote, to the Valley and never gotten out of the city is quite high. But there's kind of I would say a meme that says if you're going to start a consumer internet company, you better move to this area to do it. And so you get a lot of the thinkers about new application scenarios that are in the area, and it's good to see those early. It's good to get them on your platform, and in some cases, it's good to buy them. And we have we do actually have all of the above interests, so I highlight them. The enterprise stuff is here. It's a little dormant right now. I was telling Reid earlier, I think there's a pendulum that swings at least in the investment community. Oh, we only do enterprise deals. Oh, we only do consumer deals. And I think it's swinging back a little bit towards the enterprise side. But if you look at a lot of the interesting stuff, and again, we've got a platform interest, and we bought Yammer. We have a acquisitive side. We have thousands of people working for us down here. Thousands of people, Mountain View, the city, Palo Alto. It's really and mostly as a result of growth from things that we've acquired down here, and we're interested in that. We've got a team under Dan Lewin who's sitting here at the head table. That's DAN''L. Lewin@Microsoft.com. You can ask him what his mother and father were thinking, but I spell it for you. Feel free to email him at any time. But we got a team down here only working with VCs and startup companies and trying to make sure that we are helpful in ways that are also helpful to our interests. So on the enterprise side, on the consumer side, and then there are big companies down here. That's the 4th Silicon Valley, and it's hard to call them, quote, Silicon Valley, but Intel is here, Cisco is here, HP is here. Guys we compete with are here.
A few at least.
Big guys we compete with are here. Most of the big guys we compete with are here. Big guys. So, in a sense, you could say it's almost like a 4th Silicon Valley. It's not necessarily feels very plugged into the other 3.
Are there any of the particular tech trends that you see currently, like big data, other kinds of things that you think are particularly interesting interface points?
They're all actually pretty interesting, and a lot I mean, it's sort of all the sun and the moon and the stars align that this happens to be, in an overwhelming way, a place where people from around the world will come and start companies. And it has to do with universities and history and venture capital community and nice weather. I believe that actually.
Nice weather is actually.
I think nice weather is a systemic issue that most other places can't address. Even if they can talk about opening new universities and having a lot more venture capital funding, they can't make the sun shine and have it stay warm. And so
I think you have sun breaks up in.
We do
Seattle.
have sun breaks. Yeah. Reid used to own a house up our way, so I can't misrepresent our weather. But the truth of the matter is, there are big trends in a number of areas. There's UI innovation on devices. We're doing a lot of that work ourselves, and we're also watching, what's going on down here. When it came to Connect, there were technologies certainly that we licensed. There's technologies we look at every day in the UI field, and UI and form factor will evolve. Second one I'd highlight, I'll call it machine learning rather than big data. I'd like to emphasize for our people, it's the value that comes out of the data, and it's the fact that it's statistical. The thing that's most interesting about, quote, big data is people will write programs differently than they write them today. Today, inputs, algorithm, deterministic outputs. And big data and machine learning is about inputs, good guesses, revise the guesses, and do it again. And that's not the way most people, at least my generation, grew up writing software. So machine learning gets at kind of some of the statistical techniques that we will use with these large data sets. There's a lot of innovation. Again, if you look at most of the companies in that area, we've bought some down here, and there's a lot more going on. The cloud, if you look at the infrastructure for the cloud, the enterprise applications, and then you look at new application innovation. Those are probably the 4 areas I'd highlight the most. New form factors, machine learning, the cloud is an ongoing point of innovation, not just a transformation, and then new application scenarios. And I find companies doing interesting work. Right now, with Windows Phone and Surface and Windows 8 coming to market, relatively speaking, probably spending more time with consumer-oriented, consumer-focused, because that's where a lot of the oomph has been in terms of getting, phone and next-generation Windows 8 applications written. But it definitely goes in cycle. Certainly, our R&D folks are spending as much time with people in the other areas, either working on partnerships, sourcing technologies as a vendor, buying companies. We buy little companies all the time that nobody pays any attention to. And then when we spend $1 billion, everybody pays attention.
Yes. This question, I think you've answered parts of it, but it's probably good to have it just kind of straight as what's the upgrade case to Windows 8, right? I mean, obviously you can bits and pieces from the vision together, but if you already have a whole bunch of Windows PCs, why buy Windows 8?
Well, just start with this. Windows 8 is just better than Windows 7. It boots faster, it takes less memory, it has more kind of good characteristics from an enterprise perspective in terms of portability, whether it's Windows to go, security. You can name almost, it takes less system resources. It runs with the exception of a few system utilities and antivirus in that area. It runs basically all Windows 7 applications. So you have an install base of about 670 million Windows 7 systems in the world, and they're all just run better, whether you have touch or not touch. And then people say, is there some adjustment because the UI is different? And the answer is, there's some. But if you want to pin everything on your desktop, which is what a lot of people do anyway, and you want to live in the desktop, you pretty much can. And yet what we find is people are far more interested than they thought they would be in the generation of new applications, and particularly our start screen as this kind of funny, I'll call it in an enterprise way, a digital dashboard. But I love seeing the news feeds, the stock feeds, the Twitter feeds. They're all going past me kind of on the screen. And if something catches my interest, boom, I dive in immediately because it's kind of alive with the activity that's important to me.
And so it's a combination of a better product in terms of generally faster and all the rest of things, but also these news feeds have something for the business, their enterprise, to be thinking about, look, this will help productivity. This is a reason actually,
the number, I was with the CEO of one of the world's largest banks last week. And, he interested, friendly. And then I popped open the machine and I showed it to him. And he said, "Oh, you mean in the bank branches we could put like 5 live tiles up with the hot information that the manager needs to know about what's going on in the store, and they could just click on it and get more data? Would that be okay?" I said, "Yeah, baby, let's rock and roll." I got email from him saying, "We want to do a bank-wide deployment on this thing. I'm commanding my IT guy to get after it." It's very exciting. For me, very exciting, because they have a lot of branches. It gets particularly exciting. But it is compelling because at the end of the day, what people want is information at a glance. And there's a lot in Windows 8 from the consumer perspective, but there's a lot of ability for businesses to kind of put front ends on their apps that make these systems alive with the activity that people need to know in their jobs. Plant floor, bank branches, call centers, you name it, it's valuable.
What do you think is the least understood part of Microsoft's view of the future, right? E.g., it's kind of one of the questions that Peter Thiel, a friend of mine you've met, likes to ask his interviewers is the thing they believe that no one else believes. And this is essentially a version of that kind of contrarian question, which is, what do you think that is the thing that, like, people know how strong it is, set of different products, but what's the part of the vision that is the least understood that you think that people should go, here's how this is what I learned about the future from talking to the CEO of Microsoft?
I won't try to boil the ocean. I'll pick one technology area that we've invested more in than everybody, but maybe one other company on the planet, and I think a lot of people just aren't investing much in, and that's this theme of quote, machine learning, unquote. Whether it's what we've done in Bing, which is the engine which we have learned and the engine that we are currently monetizing, the work we do in our research team, it's a huge, let me just take one example. I was down in Vegas on business about 1.5 years ago and met with the chief information officer, chief marketing officer of one of the casino chains. You wouldn't think this is a machine learning environment necessarily, but they described their problem. It's not getting people to come back to Vegas. It's to spend all their money, plus 20%, in their establishments, not their competition. And they want to literally be tracking you with your card. They want to follow you. They want to pattern match to you, and they want to real time suggest to you, you want to try this table, you're going to want to try this machine, you're going to want to buy tickets to this show, because they can't afford to have you walking around Vegas not in their establishments effectively. It's a machine learning problem. It's just like search engines do in deciding when to serve up advertising. And I can go through business by business. I can go through technology product by technology product. The advantages of using these kind of machine learning techniques, I think, are huge. We've made a tremendous investment, something well noted on Wall Street. They say, hey, you haven't made any money in this big thing. And I say, wow, am I glad we've made that investment. And it's not an easy investment to make. It's not easy to make in terms of talent. It's not easy to make in terms of infrastructure. There are big data companies coming on, but you kind of have a bootstrap problem. You don't have big data until you have it. And, that sounds kind of silly, but indexing the web is kind of the biggest big data problem, or mapping the earth is the biggest big data problem, or mapping language and the way people use it to command and control systems. These are big data / machine learning, and we've made a big investment, and it's one I'm probably far more excited about than let me say, our kind of people would think typically.
Yeah, awesome. Well, you're enormously busy. I think we should extend you a hand in your busy schedule for coming.
Thank you.
It's awesome. Yeah.
That's great.
And I think.
So thank you so much, Steve, for sharing your perspectives with us so candidly. And Reid, thank you for your masterful interviewing. Hope you'll come back and do this again, both of you. As a small symbol of our thanks, we have for you the Churchill Club bowler, symbolizing positive change. And Steve, one more thing before you go.
Steve.
Can I get you to sign my Surface?
Oh, awesome.
Absolutely. I better not get 750 tonight, but
Might have to run for the hills.
yeah.
And thank you so much again to our sponsors, Microsoft, Jabra, Luxembourg team, Intel, Nokia, and you have been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. Good night. Thank you. Oh.